Our stitch length sample. Our concept is that the smaller the stitch, the smaller the stitches. The larger the stitch length, the larger the stitches. So if we have a stitch length of 1, that is going to be called a reinforcement stitch, which are going to be tiny little stitches that are hard to unpick. 2.5 stitch length is going to be our regulation stitch. This is the average stitch length and is used regularly when we sew. A stitch length of 5 is our basting stitch. This is a long temporary stitch that can be removed easily and not meant to be permanent in your final project. Our steps say that on one 5x5 piece of sample fabric, use a ruler and a marking pen to draw 5 lines, about every 1 inch. It's not going to be 5 inches exactly, but it's going to be pretty close. I'm going to take a sample piece of fabric and just with a regular ruler, I'm going to draw 5 lines. Your instructions say that they should be about every 1 inch. However, that doesn't have to be the case. If you do it every 1 inch, they're not going to show up. As long as you have 5 lines that run the length of your sample, that's all that I'm worried about. These lines will be what you trace over when you start sewing on your sample. I have 4 lines, I need 1 more. We're going to squeeze that in on the end. Step number 2 says to label from right to left 1, 2, 2.5, 3, and 5, just like the picture below. So we're starting in reverse order. 1, 2, 2.5, 3, and 5. Use your marking pen to mark this. Start with the furthest left line, line number 5. Adjust the stitch length to 5 and sew a straight line, back stitch. Trim your loose thread. So here I have my screen. I need to adjust my stitch length all the way up to 5. I'm going to use the bottom right arrow and hold it down until I get to 5. Now I'm ready to begin stitching. As you begin stitching the first line, make sure that when your presser foot goes down, that the needle will be going into the fabric and that you'll be following the line in which we've drawn. Have the threads tucked to the back. You can even hold them in place to make sure that they don't wrap around and get trapped in with the rest of the seam. Back stitch at the beginning and the end. Back stitching is 3 to 5 stitches. Since this basting stitch is quite a bit longer, I'm only going to go with 3. I'm going to push and hold my reverse button, reverse 3 stitches, let go, and then sew the remainder of the line. Use the entire length of your fabric, back stitching only when you get to the other end. When you finish, make sure to trim off any loose threads that might be there. Do this after each stitching line. Do not wait until the end of the sample to do it. Please do it after every stitching line. This will keep your sample looking neat and it will get threads out of the way as you work with other lines on here. Our next line is to repeat the process but with a stitch length of 3. I'm going to adjust my stitch length down to 3 for my next line of my sewing length sample. Again, make sure that your threads are to the back of the machine and that when you put your presser foot down silently, the threads are to the back and out of the way. Begin stitching again, 3 to 5 stitches for back stitching. Release and continue to sew the length of your fabric. Continue this process with each step and each length of stitches. on your last row, row 1, it will take a lot longer because the stitches are significantly smaller with each line. It's going to take a little bit longer. Now, with number 1, you have the choice to backstitch or not. The stitches are small enough that they're going to be very difficult to come out. And if you backstitch on a stitch length of 1, as tiny as those stitches are, just pray you never have to unstitch them with a seam ripper. It takes forever. Once you've completed your sample, attach the sample without any loose threads or strings. Attach it to your paper using a straight pin. Go all the way down through all layers of your paper and then come back up. So you need to see the start and the stop of the pin on both sides of your fabric.